Hello, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of Rev 250's advisory committee and professor of history at Suffolk University. And Rev 250 is a consortium of 70 organizations in and around Massachusetts looking to commemorate the beginning of the American Revolution. And today, actually, we have someone from one of our partner organizations, the American Antiquarian Society. Really delighted to welcome James David Moran, who is the Vice President for Programs and Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society. Thanks for joining us, Jim.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to see you. And you're here to talk about one of the extraordinary characters from the period, Isaiah Thomas, who is the founder of the American Antiquarian Society, as well as one of the most important printers in the American Revolution.
In some ways, he's the founding father nobody ever has heard of. And I think he's somebody who should be better known to us today. He was an extraordinary individual. I will start by saying what he did not do. He never played basketball.
Mm-hmm. That was my next question.
But other than that, he was a very important person, both around the revolution and in the founding and early years of our republic. He was a printer, as you said, and a publisher. He eventually will become the foremost publisher of his generation and of the early republic of the country. And in that role, I think he had a great deal to do with forming the cultural landscape that we consider American in many very important ways. And also in founding the American Antiquarian Society, did all of us great service in terms of preserving that past, in which I think without Thomas, it's fair to say much might have been lost. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit.
Yeah. One of the most dramatic episodes is on the 16th of April of 1775, when he moves his printing press out of Boston. He's publishing the Massachusetts Spy, which is a widely circulated paper, and he gets it out of town.
Yeah, he is. So the Spy is the first newspaper designed for the middling or middle class, as we would call it. He envisions this as a paper that will be read by people who are not particularly literate or highbrow. So he's constructing his articles and even the layout of the paper to appeal to those people. He starts publishing in 1770, and the paper becomes enormously successful. As you said, it's all papers at this time are distributed by subscriptions, and the average subscription rate for newspapers is about 500 or 600. Thomas has 3,500 subscribers by the spring of 1775. And although he begins in 1770 wanting this paper to be very neutral, he wants to put both loyalist and Whig opinions in his paper, he finds that that's virtually impossible to do, and his own sentiments are to be more of a rabble-rouser, and so it becomes much more of a pro-Whig paper. And in fact, he's threatened by the authorities in Boston on numerous occasions. He is closely tied with the Sons of Liberty as well, publishing in secret some of their pamphlets. And the Spy is becoming more and more their voice, their house organ. Mm-hmm. So Hancock urges him to get the press out of Boston. They're concerned that something's going to happen, probably some sort of violence. They don't know what in mid-April, but they're concerned that the authorities will, in all likelihood, not destroy the press, although that's a possibility, but impound it and keep it for their own purposes. So Thomas, with the help of Joseph Warren and Timothy Bigelow, pack up the press, and in Thomas's own words, which I think are interesting, they steal it. I stole it out of Boston literally in the middle of the night. They ferry it across to Charlestown and eventually then cart it by wagon to Worcester. And Worcester is a hotbed of Whig activity, or what we refer to today as Patriot, although that's a problematic term. It's probably the best way for us to kind of envision those people who were radically opposing the royal authorities and, in fact, advocating it in some ways for complete independence. And Worcester is a hotbed of that activity. In fact, there are more arms and ammunition stored in Worcester than there are anywhere else in the Commonwealth. And as you, I'm sure, know, the British authorities were thinking about raiding Worcester and then determined it was just too far and there were too many people in opposition. So they settled on Lexington and Concord. So
Yes.
Thomas brings his press to Worcester. He sets it up in the basement of Bigelow's home. Bigelow is a blacksmith who has married well, and he has a very large home on the north end of Main Street in Worcester. Worcester is a tiny tiny town at this point, but it is the shire town. It's the place where the courts meet. So several times a year, it blossoms into this huge town with lots of people coming in to do court business and to engage in other kinds of businesses. Blacksmiths would have done very well as people came in to have things repaired or bought tools and implements. Bigelow is also a captain in the militia and will rise to become a colonel in the American Army. So, he's been advocating that Thomas set up a press in Worcester for quite some time. So Thomas comes, he sets up his press, and then he goes to Lexington. And we know he is present in Lexington. We think he was there at the Green. What else he's doing that day, it's a little bit unclear, but he is clearly an eyewitness to the events that are occurring then. And then he comes back to Worcester and he waits for paper. He has everything he needs except paper. John Hancock, on his route to sit as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, visits Thomas as he is en route and writes a note, which we have in our collection, a letter to the Committee of Safety. And it's very interesting. He's not clear where the Committee of Safety, where all the members of that committee are after Lexington and Concord. You know, we kind of forget, I think, sometimes how much this is a disrupting influence. It's, you know, we kind of think, oh, the shot heard round the world, and then we're marching on to, you know, to freedom and to independence. But in fact, it just is very confusing. Many people are even in panic that the regulars are going to come back out again from the city and wreak even more damage than they did. So Hancock writes and says, you got to send paper to Thomas because we need him to do his public service, which is to publish the Massachusetts Spy and to particularly form those 3,500 subscribers who are more than just Massachusetts. He has subscribers up and down the colonies to tell the story of why we engaged in this violent act.
Wow. Yeah. And so he does get the paper. And
he finally gets the paper. And on May 3rd, he prints his issue of the Spy, which has his firsthand account of the battles of Lexington and Concord, which are not impartial journalism as we know it. It's filled with hyperbole about the attacks that the British troops and the injustices and the atrocities they commit, and basically paints a picture of, you know, there was no reason for this. We were law-abiding citizens. Our government just viciously attacked us, completely ignoring the fact that we're also an armed militia waiting for them at dawn on the town green. It doesn't quite fit the narrative, so we will mention that. But his account is very powerful. It's very emotional, and it does bear a certain level of truism because he is an eyewitness account to it, and it is widely circulated and widely reprinted as well. And you know, I think one of the biggest things that Thomas does as a patriot and for the cause is as a promoter. And we
Hmm.
get kind of we don't think too much about marketeers and advertising and promotional people these days. We think of them as being kind of Madison men, and we conjure up Mad Men, and that TV series, and that sense of
Yes.
kind of hawking
Hmm.
cigarettes to people instead of. But in
Hmm.
point of fact, if wars are important, you need to promote. Or if nobody shows up for a war,
Right.
you don't have a war. And
Yeah.
that promotion is a key element. And Thomas not only has this circulation, but he has the method to distribute this news. He has worked with
Hmm.
in the months in the year before the outbreak of violence. He's worked with other printers and publishers in Connecticut and New Jersey to set up a system of postriders, essentially a private postal system, to ensure that they can
Wow.
move their own prints through the countryside and get
Mm-hmm.
them to their subscribers. They're also carrying other mail, letters and packages and other
Hmm.
prints, but they're, largely a private circulating postal service.
Hmm.
And he employs that in spreading both the alarm of Lexington and
Hmm.
Concord, but also the news. Um,
Yes.
Bissell is, Israel Bissell is his famous story of him spreading the alarm, one of the first to spread the alarm on the 19th of April, and riding into Worcester and saying,
Hmm.
war is broken out, and his horse then collapsed from exhaustion. That's the apocryphal story. I don't
Yeah.
know that it has much validity, but we don't necessarily want the facts to get in the way of a good story, now do we?
That's right. That's right. Yes.
But he is a postwriter for Thomas. He
Yeah.
is his day job is to, in
Okay.
a way, is to deliver Thomas's Massachusetts spy. So
Wow.
this network of communication is essential for
Hmm.
rallying support for the war, and for then executing the war in terms of getting vital information to the parties that are waging the war.
Okay. Yeah. Now, we were talking earlier about Thomas being a much more relatable character than a lot of others of those we think of as the founders. I mean, he has an extraordinary background
Yeah, he did.
up till
Yeah,
the time he enters into the story of the
yeah.
revolution. Yeah, his
Yeah,
father abandons the family.
he's actually born into a well-off family in Boston. They're merchants,
Hmm.
but his father is a bit of a ne'er-do-well and abandons the
Hmm.
family and then dies in the southern colonies, which outrages Thomas's grandfather, and he disinherits Thomas's mother, and essentially she's left
Wow.
impoverished. And she has
Wow.
5 children to support, and she sends some of them to live with relatives, and keeps the youngest daughter with her, but puts Thomas into an apprenticeship with a printer of ballads named Zachariah
Hmm.
Fowle, under the auspices of the overseers of the poor. So essentially, he's
Hmm.
a poor orphan.
Yeah.
I mean, he's
Yeah.
not literally an orphan, but essentially he is. And he is at the age of 6, he's placed into this apprenticeship where apprenticeships, of course, are not unusual at this time, but putting someone so young in apprenticeship is fairly
Yeah.
unusual. And he can't do much as a worker,
Yeah.
but he, does what he can. And he literally learns to read and write by setting type.
Hmm.
He soon, I think, outstrips his master's abilities as a printer.
Hmm.
He bristles at being an apprentice early on, and like Franklin, who is another famous printer
Yes. Yeah.
of the generation before him,
Right.
runs
Yes.
away from his apprenticeship and
Hmm.
seeks a position as a printer by bumming around the colonies. He goes down to the southern colonies. He goes up
Hmm.
to Nova Scotia. Is involved in the Stamp Act controversy in Halifax.
Hmm.
Continues to bum around looking for positions until he finally comes back to Boston and enters into a partnership with Fowle. He, as I said, he's instrumental in starting the revolution, and then after the revolution, he becomes a very successful printer and publisher.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
he controls all aspects of his printing operation, including having parts of a paper mill operation. He works with many of his former apprentices to set up kind of essentially satellite operations.
Hmm.
Has a big printing operation in Worcester, about 15 presses in operation, and a similar operation in Boston. So he's the most important, foremost printer of his day. And
Franklin calls him the American Baskerville. Baskerville was the leading
right,
printer in England. And so this is a
yes,
high praise for Franklin to say this guy is the leading American printer. And he's also publishing books. He starts a whole book distribution network in bookstores.
right. And he's publishing, continues to publish pamphlets and starts a magazine. Will, like every printer, publish an almanac. He is, I sometimes like to refer to him as the kind of the Bill Gates of his day. And by that, I mean, Gates, Microsoft has impacted virtually every aspect of our lives. And in
Yes.
doing, has made Gates one of the wealthiest people in the world. Thomas similarly impacted everything that people did. When you think about it, they would have planted their crops based upon the forecast in his almanacs. They
Yes.
would have learned to read and write with his primers. They would have worshipped with his Bibles and instructional booklets. They would have enjoyed their leisure by his reading his novels and collections of poetry, and they would have gotten their news and information through his newspapers and magazines. So he's really impacting virtually every aspect of people's lives. And in deciding what to print, he is shaping what will become a very distinct American culture. Certainly, we are very influenced, continue to be influenced by Europe and English imprints, but what in terms he is generating American talent like Phyllis Wheatley and Noah Webster, whom he also publishes, he's beginning to really shape what we consider to be the beginnings of a distinct American culture.
Yes. I actually have an edition of the almanac here. It was
published. Great. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. And he
it's
is,
really, and then
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go on, Jim.
Well, and then I think at some point in his life, he starts to recognize that he was part of an extraordinary period in history. He was one of those people who helped found a nation. And the press had a really powerful role in that, perhaps one of the first times in world history. And he retires from active business as one of the wealthiest people in the country. He has a net worth that he estimates it worth $162,000, which doesn't seem like much to us, but was then an incredible fortune. And he devotes his time to writing what will become a 2-volume history of printing in this country, which is still an amazing resource for historians. And then decides that he wants to found a learned society, much like patterned after those in Europe, but also distinctly American. And that's the American Antiquarian Society, which still thrives today. And I think the other extraordinary thing about Thomas is that I think because he's a printer and because he understands in a very emotional way what goes into printing anything, from a flyer that is full of doggerel to the Declaration of Independence, he wants to save and preserve them. And so he creates a library, which the American Antiquarian Society is a national research library as well as a learned society. But the library is founded on preserving everything in a very democratic way. So we've got broadside ballads and the equivalent of historic junk mail, along with the great state papers and great works of literature. And I think it's that democratic sensibility that infused his own collecting and his own sense of what the society should be, that has continued down through the ages to us today. And the result is that we've got an enormous amount of imprints that not only describe the major intellectual currents of the time, but help us understand how people actually lived.
Yes.
What they bought, what they sold, what they felt was important, the dirty songs they sang in their taverns, the way they buried each other, all of the things that really help us understand what it was to live, which has been an extraordinary resource, particularly for social historians who are trying to just get at that sense of how did average people live 200 years ago.
Right. It really is. And your background isn't really in history, but in creative writing. But you've been able to take these, so that means you've been able to take these great stories you have found and turn them into plays. And you have a one-man show about Isaiah Thomas, which is tells this story. And you've done other plays as well. We'll talk a little bit about Thomas, the Patriot printer.
Yeah, I was. I came to the society with this set of skills, and when Thomas was celebrating his 250th birthday, or we were celebrating it for him, Ellen Dunlap, the president of the society, asked me if I would write a play to commemorate Thomas's life, and I did create a play called "Preserving All Others," which was a fully realized one-act play, one-person play that just tells his story and particularly emphasizes his generosity, which is what I discovered in researching Thomas, that he was not only preserving all kinds of imprints, but was very instrumental in preserving a lot of the people in his life as well. And then I created a second play called Isaiah Thomas Patriot Printer, which was designed for educational purposes and brings the same professional actor, his name is Neil Gustafson, into classrooms, but it tells the story of his life and the founding of the country through selected documents that Thomas either had some emotional connection to. He either created them as a printer, or he preserved them in some way. And many of them are connected to our national story as well, or one of our national stories, I should say. And as one example, Thomas was the first person to read the Declaration of Independence aloud in Massachusetts. So that's one of the documents that he talks about, as is the May 3rd, 1775 issue of the Mass Spy. And we've been doing this, well, before the pandemic, we were doing this quite a bit. We were bringing it to every fifth grade classroom in the city of Worcester, and we premiered it in 2000. And since that time, I think about over 15,000 people have witnessed the show in one form or another. Wow. So it's been quite successful. So Thomas has got this other life in a way, and again, he resonates particularly with young people because of his early background of being abandoned by his father, by dealing with a single mother who is, incapable of taking care of him, and then his struggle to find a career and to rise in the world in a time when, self-made people were not what the 18th century was about. I mean, there were a lot of self-made people in the 18th century, but we didn't venerate it the way we do today.
Right.
It was, so it was a very different world that he lived in.
It really was. And we're grateful to the AAS for collecting and for maintaining this mission of preserving these stories of his and others that you can find in the tremendous archives at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. So we're talking with Jim Moran, who is the Vice President for Programs and Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society. And we've been talking about the life and career of Isaiah Thomas, the printer, as Jim said, not the basketball player. So it's hope to get more recognition for Thomas, the printer, and really one of the great figures of the Revolutionary period. There's one episode when he's at his printing press and the governor's council wants to talk to him about something he has printed. And so, I mean, can you tell us this story?
Yeah. They're upset with him. They're summoning him, and he Thomas was first of all, I should step back a little bit and say that he was a tall and handsome man, and particularly as a young man, I think full of a certain charm that impressed people. And so he was very persuasive in many ways and very headstrong. He didn't get, as many self-made people are. And he's working at his press when he is summoned by the council, and he refuses to go. He then, I think, sends away the courier and says, "I'm busy. I can't leave my press." He then, I guess, when the courier leaves, he then does summon some legal advice from none other than John Adams, who tells him that they have no legal authority to summons him. And but lo and behold, the courier comes back to summon again, and Thomas tells him that he will not reply to this because the summons is not in writing. And so he manages to escape any kind of being brought before, but he is clearly threatened throughout the period when he's in Boston, both from many loyalist factions as well as from the government. He is, clearly, and his reputation actually is also preceding him to other parts of the country. He's burned in effigy in New Bern, South Carolina, for what appears in the. And so he's becoming this kind of, figure of protest that is very valuable as a symbol, as well as for what he's actually doing.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing I will say about Thomas is that he has a personal life that is, in some ways seems very contemporary to us.
Yes.
As he is fermenting revolution and packing his press up and moving it to a safe location and printing all kinds of incendiary literature, his wife, who he meets in Bermuda, and who evidently was a very beautiful and vivacious woman, runs off with an American-born British officer by the name of Benjamin Thompson. Thompson actually will go on and become Count Rumford. He will become a famous. Yeah, he becomes a famous scientist in his own right after the revolution. But at this point, he's just a dashing man in uniform. And,
another dashing man.
Yes, another dashing man. And of course, this is incredibly embarrassing on many levels for Thomas. They do have two young children. They have a daughter and a son. And Thomas will divorce her. This all happens in the spring of 1775, and he winds up completely divorcing her in 1777. But the interesting thing I think about Thomas, and why I titled my play Preserving All Others, is that there is evidence that he supported Mary Dill, his first wife, throughout her life, which I think is an extraordinary thing. When we think about the context of men and women in the 18th century and the complete lack of understanding or appreciation for women beyond giving birth and being domestic help. There's no rights, no consciousness on the part of men that they would need to protect them or help them. And for somebody to run away with the way she did, there would be no sense that society would not expect him to do anything but abandon her.
And so what about the children?
He has a daughter, Mary, and a son, Isaiah. Isaiah will eventually become part of Thomas's business, but he doesn't have the business acumen that the older Isaiah Thomas had, and he will eventually die prematurely from a fall. Many people speculated that he may have had a drinking or some sort of
Mm.
substance
Mhm.
abuse problem, and that may have been
Mhm.
why he fell as he did. But there again, Thomas will support most of his grandchildren, all of his
Mhm.
extended family, in
Mhm.
one fashion or another. So he's very, in his own way, a very generous and
Yeah,
unusually generous person, I think, for his time.
it really is. Is there anything else you would like to tell us, Jim? Our time is nearly up about Thomas or about the American Antiquarian Society.
Well, I would just say that we are uh, here when the pandemic opens for people to come and once again, when we're able to open, I should say, after the pandemic, to come and explore the resources. We do have some films that we've created of our play based upon the play. One shows Thomas. Putting out the mass spy, that's available online through the link at the bottom of the screen. We have another website that we're developing about Isaiah Thomas as a printer that has a film about his apprenticeship. And again, that's on the link at the bottom of the screen. So people can further explore Thomas's incredible life through these resources and others. And we welcome people to do that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Jim Moran, the American Antiquarian Society, and the playwright, historian, and telling us the story of Isaiah Thomas. So thank you for joining us, and
Thank you for
thank
having me
you to all
so
who are
much.
listening. Thanks. And now we will have Doug Quigley and Peter and Dave Emmerich leading us out on the road to Boston. So thank you.